I was on my way to the post office to ship a package when my car died. I'm a student living with my parents. Neither me nor them have the money to fix such a seemingly unimportant problem. Unfortunately, the gas gauge is one of the problem sections. It seems to only work when it wants to. Under 1/4 of a tank, you can't trust it. The day of my post office trip, my tank must have run empty. This time I was on a quiet part of a road. I checked my phone and found a gas station less than a mile away. I was a few minutes into my walk when I heard a car approaching me from behind. As the car passed, it began to slow down. I looked over and saw a young man leaning out of the passenger window. He was smiling and looked like a kind person. I nodded and said hello in a nice voice. I returned my gaze forward and continued my walk. I'd walk about 5 steps when the passenger called out to me. "Need a ride?" A chill ran down my back. You see, he'd asked this, but ended his question with a derogatory slur. All I'll say is that it starts with a P. This guy appeared to be looking for a fight. I'm not a tough guy and have gone out of my way to treat people with respect. I pretended like I hadn't heard him and kept walking. He yelled it out again. Now he sounded angry. I started walking faster. The driver sped up to catch me. The passenger called out to me again. "Hey, didn't you hear me?" He ended his question with the same slur. I had begun to shake now. I was terrified they were going to attack me. Somehow I summoned up the courage to tell him that I didn't want any trouble, and he just laughed and said, "I ought to kick you in the teeth for talking back to me." I panicked and started running. I was trapped alongside the road with nowhere else to go. I could hear the car driving just behind me. My only hope was the intersection about 50 yards ahead. I could see a car coming from the opposite direction and hoped this would deter them from assaulting me. I was about 30 yards from the stop sign when I heard the car speed up. Just as they passed me, I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head, and that's when everything went black. When I woke up, I saw a middle-aged woman and a man kneeling over me. She said an ambulance was on its way. Then she said something that seemed so odd at the time. "Don't worry. We saw those boys throw that bottle. Donnie got their plate." The ambulance took me away and I stayed overnight at the hospital for observation. Our house is the only place I feel safe now. I still have nightmares and the loss of sleep has affected me psychologically. In 2012, I was 19 and still living with my parents. I had dreams of getting my own place as far away from my hometown as I could get. The majority of my time was spent working, often double shifts. I was a line cook but would also wash dishes to get extra time on the clock. In spite of my rocky relationship with my parents, they did allow me to use an old Toyota that they had purchased for my sister. In addition to all the hours I was working, I was also serving as a de facto taxi service for a friend. He wanted to move away himself and worked almost as many hours as I did. In fact, he would go on to be one of my roommates a few years later. He and I made an agreement where he'd pay me $20 a month on top of a full tank of gas a week for the privilege. Something that I wasn't really mindful of then was how all the hours of work were affecting me at the end of the day. Driving 15 extra miles a night after working 12+ hours a day was a recipe for disaster. Whether it was someone looking out for me or I just got lucky, I was fortunate to only receive a few cuts and bruises from my negligence. The date on the photos is September 17th, 2012. I know for sure the wreck had been on a Saturday night. Therefore, my best guess is that the accident took place on the 15th. The date may be a little hazy, but the rest of that evening is still crystal clear. I'd worked a total of 14 hours that day and fully intended to meet some friends for coffee after stopping home for a quick shower. When I left the restaurant, I didn't feel any more tired than usual. From the restaurant, I drove to the next town over and picked up my friend. I managed to drop him off and was about halfway home when the need to sleep really hit me. Back then, I rolled down the window and lit up a I hoped the fresh air and nicotine would wake me up a little, but nothing really changed. I was about a quarter of a mile from my exit. I could see the lights of my neighborhood in the distance, and this is the last thing I remember. My next memory was oddly surreal. I found myself hanging upside down with people shouting at me. I was blinded by the beam of a flashlight, and the man asked me if I was okay. I didn't hurt anywhere, so I said yes. Before thinking it through, I undid my belt and dropped on my head. This whole time, voices from outside the car are yelling out to me to be careful and asking if I'd been drinking. I was able to crawl out of the window and get to my feet. I began to feel a bit dizzy, and a man suggested I come over to his truck and sit on his tailgate. Once I did, I felt a lot better. While we sat and waited for the emergency responders, I looked over at my poor Camry in disbelief. I remained unsure of how I rolled over. The passenger side was squashed, yet the roof was relatively intact. Soon, the cops and EMS arrived. While the paramedics looked me over, the cops gave me a rudimentary sobriety test. At the hospital, a sample of was also taken to confirm. I was there about 45 minutes when my parents arrived. I guess someone had notified them. My mom was freaking out like you'd expect, but my dad assumed that I'd been drinking and began grilling me about it. The hospital released me in the early hours of that morning, and even after all these years, my dad still hasn't apologized. The insurance company wrote the car off as a complete loss, and our rates went up considerably for a while. It may sound funny, but lack of sleep takes as many or more lives on our highways as driving. I'm a 24-year-old woman currently living and working in the west of the United States. A few weeks ago, I had a strange and scary encounter. Two of my friends happened to have their birthdays on the same week, and I was busy trying to find them the perfect gifts. I was returning home from a 30-mile round trip. About 20 miles from home, my front left tire went flat. I pulled off onto a wide section of the shoulder and got out to look. The tire had a huge hole in it, but fortunately, I do have AAA just for times like this. I searched through my phone for the number. I dialed it, and just then, an old work truck pulled up in front of me and parked. I assumed it was a good Samaritan looking to help. I got out to let him know that I was okay, and he claimed to be with AAA and pointed to the AAA sticker on my window. I questioned him about his truck. He claimed to actually be a subcontractor for the company. He walked back over to his truck, and now that he was out of earshot, I asked the operator if they use contractors. They do, but all of them drive tow trucks in case a tow is needed. This was not what I wanted to hear, and a sick feeling filled my stomach. I quickly explained the situation, and she promised to send an officer along with roadside assistance. I put the phone in my pocket and waved the man over. He seemed like he was beginning to get nervous. I figured that I need to keep him busy. I began asking a bunch of stupid questions. Very few made any sense or pertained to the subject. He looked annoyed but answered every one. Suddenly, my phone rang, and it was AAA. I answered, and the operator asked if I was okay. I told her that I was and apologized for hanging up on her. The man must have smelled a rat, and he began looking around. I looked at him, apologized, and mouthed the words that it was my husband. I told him that it would just be a minute. The operator assured me that the officer was on his way and he shouldn't be much longer, and she was right. Less than a minute later, a police car pulled up behind his truck. The man said that he had to go and quickly walked away, but thankfully the officer caught up with him before he could escape. I got in my car and watched as the cop spoke to the man. Soon, another cop car arrived and joined him. Just a minute or two passed, and the real AAA assistant showed up. As he was wrapping up his work, the cop put cuffs on the guy and took him away. I was relieved. I thanked the mechanic and went on my way. I arrived home soon after and have been wondering what became of that fake serviceman ever since. And to date, I haven't received any calls from police or AAA, and that's probably a good sign. I just turned 20 the year the towers went down. I was just some unskilled college dropout training to be a carpenter's apprentice, and life wasn't any different than I imagined it for most guys of that age. My parents disowned me when I dropped out, and I was fortunate to find a cheap garage apartment near my job. At that time, I was getting around in a 1991 Honda my parents had given me on my 18th birthday. It was the height of summer, and I was driving home from work. A train stopped traffic for about 10 minutes. Sitting and waiting caused my engine to overheat, and I was forced to turn on the heater even though it was well over 100 degrees. A few minutes later, the train ended and the gate lifted. Traffic began again, but the overheat light stayed on, and I knew that I was screwed. I had passed a small service station a few miles back. I hoped someone there could help me out, or at least keep the car going until I got home. As if it mattered, I rolled up the windows. You didn't think I had AC, did you? Locked the doors and began the long walk to the shop. The walk was long and far from a great experience, but I was young and used to the heat. I managed to arrive at the station within about 45 minutes. I was struck at how quiet things were. There were no people at the pumps or sounds coming from the garage. When I entered, the door chime went off. No one was behind the register, but I could hear shuffling sounds coming from around the corner. I innocently walked forward and was about to say something when I caught sight of two men struggling for a pistol on the floor. I had an immediate urge to help, but I had no idea who the good guy was in this scenario. The man on the bottom was showing signs of flagging. I could see he was only a few seconds from losing control. When he let a pitiful whine slip out, I threw all caution to the wind and jumped on top of his assailant. I put the guy in a chokehold. This drew his focus away from the struggle for the gun and allowed the other guy to pry it from his hand. This is when I locked the choke in and waited. The guy grabbed at me but was already slipping into unconsciousness. I gingerly lowered his body to the floor and looked over to the other man, and I was relieved to see the logo of the store on the breast of his shirt. On the opposite side was his name, and I leaned up and offered my hand. "Nice to meet you, Paul. Name's Mike. You okay?" He was still catching his breath, but managed to push out a rough, "Yes." He handed me the gun and asked me to watch the guy while he got some zip ties from the garage. He disappeared through a door and reappeared a few seconds later. The hold-up guy was waking up, but he was still very confused. I lifted him so Paul could attach the ties. The hold-up guy began to fight with me. Paul began punching him. It seemed a bit unfair, but I wasn't about to tell some guy who had been mere seconds from to be nice to his attacker. One of the punches rung the guy's bell and he stopped fighting. We got the ties on and I watched the guy until Paul could get the cops there. The cops were super cool about the situation, surprisingly. It turned out, the robber had knocked over several other stores in town and even shot one poor guy. If I had to guess, I'd wager the stick-up guy is dead or in prison by now. There's no future in that line of work, for certain. Now, when it was all over, I got a tow truck to bring my car to another shop. The driver happened to be on the way to another call and dropped me off at home. A few days later, I stopped off to check on Paul, and he gave me the details on how everything started. The craziest part was that he wasn't even the regular cashier. He was just a guy who worked on cars. He was doing an oil change when he heard the door chime. The gunman approached him just steps from the adjoining door. He noticed the guy had a ski mask on, and in his mind, this meant that he was going to die.